June 1944, Nebraska. The freight train squealed to a halt under the hot prairie sun, and the German prisoners of war, men who had marched under the swastika across Africa and Europe, stumbled down from the cars into a landscape that felt more dream than reality. They had been captured in Tunisia, shipped across the Atlantic, processed through Norfolk, and now, after days of travel, found themselves surrounded by fields so vast they seemed endless, stretching to a horizon that mocked the cramped farmlands of Bavaria or the Ruhr. For months they had lived on rations barely sufficient to keep them marching. Bread so coarse it crumbled, watery soup measured by ladles, meat only on rare occasions. Here, in the American heartland, they smelled the scent of freshly cut wheat and diesel smoke, and in that moment many realized that what they were about to witness would wound their pride more than defeat on the battlefield. A boy appeared first, no more than 16, seated atop a machine larger than any German farm cart. A John Deere tractor roared with a steady power that made the ground vibrate, its paint gleaming in the sun, pulling implements that carved the soil with mechanical precision. The boy leaned casually on the wheel, one hand resting as though guiding a toy rather than a steel monster worth more than a German officer's annual salary. The prisoners stared in silence, some muttering in disbelief, others counting the sheer size of the machine. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that American farms were backward, peasants feeding from cans, a mongrel society unfit for true discipline. Yet here was a teenager commanding a machine that could outwork an entire village of German farmers. One officer whispered that the tractor alone cost more than he had earned in 10 years of service. Another clutched his diary, recording the sight with shaking hands, certain that the censors would never allow such words to leave the camp. The Americans shouted instructions in English, pointing the prisoners toward the fields where they would work, but the men barely heard them. They were still transfixed by the tractor as it passed, pulling a harvester that devoured wheat by the acre. The mathematics were brutal. Where a German farm family with horses could plow 10 acres in a day, this single machine consumed 100. A boy barely out of school accomplished in hours what their entire village required a week to achieve. It was not just a revelation of technology, it was a revelation of power. In that instant, the prisoners felt the weight of inevitability pressing upon them. They were soldiers who had fought with courage and endured hardship, but their courage was meaningless before such abundance. If America's children could command machines with the strength of battalions, what hope did the Reich have? The fields of Nebraska spoke more clearly than any Allied propaganda leaflet. The war, they realized, was already lost. The journey that had brought them here was itself a demolition of every belief they had carried about America. They had embarked from the port of Oran in Algeria under heavy guard, expecting the transatlantic crossing to be grim and punishing, perhaps in the holds of rusting freighters or packed into filthy compartments. Instead, they boarded Liberty ships, vessels that their guards casually mentioned had been built in just days, not years. Some of the prisoners scoffed, believing it was another American exaggeration, yet even the ship beneath their feet was proof. Steel plates fit with a precision that astounded the engineers among them, welded seams running perfectly straight, the engines purring without effort, as though built in a world where resources were infinite. On deck, they saw sailors throwing away food that in Germany would have been treasured. Whole loaves of bread left uneaten, meat scraped from plates, milk poured over the rail into the sea. One man whispered that the daily waste of the crew equaled a week's ration for his unit in Africa. Another clenched his fists, furious not at the Americans, but at the lies he had believed. If this was propaganda, it was stronger than any bullet. When the Liberty ship entered the Chesapeake Bay and the sprawling facilities of Norfolk appeared, the prisoners fell silent. Cranes moved ceaselessly, lifting cargo containers larger than trucks. Dozens of ships crowded the docks, each one loading or unloading simultaneously, more tonnage in a single day than Hamburg could manage in a week. Smoke from foundries and warehouses hung in the air, but it was not the smoke of desperation or shortage. It was the steady exhaust of an economy that seemed limitless. As the prisoners disembarked and were formed into columns, they passed parking lots filled with cars, belonging not to party officials or generals, but to ordinary dock workers. In Germany, private ownership of an automobile was a dream for the elite. The so-called people's car, the Volkswagen, existed only in propaganda posters. Yet here, every worker seemed to drive. One officer muttered, astonished, that even the lowest American laborer owned more than a German officer of the Reich. The train journey west drove the message deeper. They expected boxcars, 40 men to a car, the misery they had inflicted on others across Europe. Instead, they were loaded into Pullman coaches, padded seats, dining cars, even air conditioning in some compartments. Guards apologized when it did not work properly, a luxury the prisoners could scarcely imagine. At night, as the train rolled through Virginia and Kentucky, they pressed their faces against the windows. Every village, no matter how small, blazed with electric light. Shops glowed with neon signs, houses lit from multiple rooms, street lamps stretching into the distance. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged cities into darkness since 1940. On farms, electrification reached only a fraction of households. But here, even the countryside sparkled. One prisoner, once an electrical engineer, scribbled in his diary that a single rail yard they passed consumed more electricity in an hour than his entire Berlin district used in a day. By the time the train reached Nebraska, many had stopped arguing. They had been told America was weak, divided, controlled by Jews and capitalists. They had been told its people were lazy, its democracy chaotic, its society decadent. Yet through the train windows they saw factories running night shifts, parking lots filled with hundreds of cars, mechanized equipment working without pause. The abundance was not a show staged for prisoners. It was simply daily life. The guards did not boast. They did not need to. The prisoners could see with their own eyes that everything they had been told was false. When they stepped down onto the prairie soil, the sun burning above them, they were already changed men. What awaited them in the fields of Nebraska would only finish the demolition that had begun the moment they glimpsed America's lights burning against the night. Nebraska in midsummer was a vast ocean of grain. The German prisoners marched under guard to their assigned labor, stopped involuntarily to stare at the fields. Golden waves stretched so far that the horizon seemed swallowed, broken only by the silhouettes of grain elevators and the outlines of tractors that looked more like armored vehicles than farm equipment. For men raised in a Europe of small family plots, where farms were measured in acres and tilled with horse-drawn plows, the scale alone was staggering. A single American farm, they learned, could exceed the size of an entire German village. The numbers bore it out with pitiless clarity. In 1943, American wheat production exceeded 1.2 billion bushels. Germany, even after seizing fertile lands in Poland and Ukraine, struggled to harvest 400 million. Where a German farmer with horses could till 10 to 15 acres in a day, an American combine harvester consumed 100, its mechanical jaws devouring rows of wheat without pause, day after day. The prisoners watched as a teenager guided such a combine across the field, a machine powered by a diesel engine that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their boots. The boy, no older than 16, leaned back casually in the driver's seat, as if commanding such a beast were effortless. Behind him, the harvester gathered wheat in quantities that defied imagination. One German sergeant whispered to his comrade that this boy, with his machine, was more valuable than their entire platoon of field laborers back home. A captain, once a farmer in Bavaria, muttered that the combine alone represented 10 years of his family's earnings, and yet here it was entrusted to a child. The humiliation burned deeper than chains or guard towers. What struck them hardest was the casual abundance. In Germany, every kilogram of grain was measured, every loaf of bread rationed, every acre wrung for maximum yield under the strain of shortages and war. Here in Nebraska, the yield was so great that grain elevators overflowed, and much of the surplus would never even reach the battlefield. Some of it would be fed to livestock in quantities unimaginable in Europe. Some would simply be stored against the possibility of price fluctuations. For German soldiers who had marched hungry across Russia, who had watched civilians scrape for potatoes, the idea that Americans had so much food they worried about market prices felt like a cruel joke. The guards, mostly young Americans unscarred by hunger, treated the abundance as normal. One of them explained, almost offhand, that the boy driving the combine was his cousin, working for his father's farm. The farm produced thousands of bushels each season, and the family owned not one machine but several, each one worth more than a German officer's annual pay. The prisoners exchanged glances heavy with disbelief, then silence. Propaganda had told them that Americans were soft, spoiled, incapable of sacrifice. Yet what they saw was not weakness, but an industrial agriculture so efficient that even children wielded power greater than entire regiments of laborers. Some prisoners scribbled in hidden notebooks, careful to disguise their notes as harmless observations. One wrote that a single Nebraska farm seemed capable of feeding more soldiers than a whole German province. Another calculated that the boy's machine could plow more in a day than his father and 3 brothers could in a week with horses. The realization spread through the camp like an infection. Germany's struggle was not merely against Allied armies, but against a nation whose farms alone were an arsenal. At dusk, when the prisoners were marched back to their barracks, the smell of bread baking drifted from the farmhouse. The guards handed out sandwiches for supper, thick with slices of beef and cheese, and milk poured fresh from cooling tanks. One prisoner, chewing slowly, whispered to himself that he had eaten better as a captive than as a free man in Germany. Another clenched his sandwich in trembling hands, unable to decide if he should be grateful or ashamed. The fields of Nebraska had spoken without words. America's strength was not just in its factories, but in its soil, its machines, and its ordinary families who commanded them. For the prisoners who had once believed in the promise of the Reich, the comparisons became unbearable. In Germany, the farm was still a patchwork of fields no larger than a few hectares, tilled by oxen or horses, powered by sweat and patience. Mechanization had never reached the countryside in force. Only 20% of German villages had full electrification by the time the war began, and even then, shortages of coal and copper meant power was rationed or cut entirely once the bombing campaign started. Fertilizer, the lifeblood of modern agriculture, was diverted to explosives. Farmers were left with manure and prayers, their yields shrinking, just as the army demanded more. By 1943, German rations had fallen to bread made with ersatz flour, meat no more than once or twice a week, potatoes stretched with sawdust. Families who had survived the First World War whispered that things were even worse now. The Americans, by contrast, lived in a different universe. 90% of farms had electricity by the early 1942. Barns lit at night like factories. Irrigation pumps powered by motors that ran without pause, milk cooled in steel tanks driven by refrigeration units. Chemical fertilizer poured across the soil in volumes that dwarfed anything the Reich could dream of. Entire trainloads of ammonium nitrate and phosphate produced by factories so vast they seemed like cities unto themselves. In 1943 alone, the United States produced over 5 million tons of synthetic fertilizer, more than 20 times German capacity. The result was mathematical inevitability. American corn yields reached 40 bushels per acre. German yields sank to barely half that. Where American farmers harvested 127 million tons of grain in 1944, Germany struggled to reach 30. The prisoners remembered the shortages that had plagued their homes. They thought of their mothers queuing for hours with ration cards, their sisters scavenging for firewood in bomb-shattered streets. They remembered blackout curtains drawn tight against Allied bombers, the nights of silence broken only by sirens. Yet here, in the heart of Nebraska, they saw grain elevators rising higher than church steeples, silos so full that trucks arrived in endless streams to carry away the harvest. In Germany, entire families labored from dawn to dusk to coax life from thin soil. In America, a single farmer with his sons could command machinery that replaced hundreds of hands. A Bavarian officer confessed in a low voice to his comrades that the Reich had entered the war already defeated. "We never understood," he said, that they had armies hidden not in uniforms but in machines, in the soil, in the fields. Another man, a veteran of the Eastern Front, spat into the dirt and muttered that Hitler had promised the East would feed Germany for 1,000 years. Instead, the East had become a graveyard, while the Americans harvested enough in 1 year to feed not only themselves, but the British, the Russians, and still have surplus. The guards said little. They did not need to boast. The prisoners' eyes carried the evidence. Every tractor that roared across the prairie was an artillery barrage of arithmetic. Every illuminated farmhouse was an air raid against their illusions. Every loaf of bread they received in camp was a reminder that Germany had no chance against such abundance. When night fell and they lay in their bunks, listening to the hum of power lines and the faint thunder of distant machines still working, they understood with a clarity sharper than any defeat in battle. Germany was fighting a war it could not sustain, a war against a nation whose very farms outproduced entire armies. The front lines were not only in Stalingrad or Normandy. They were here, in Nebraska, and Germany had already lost them. The shock grew unbearable when the prisoners realized that America had so much food it could afford to throw it away. On German farms, every stalk of grain, every potato pulled from the earth, every liter of milk was precious. Families saved crumbs, collected beet tops, even ground acorns to stretch their bread. In Hamburg and Cologne, people whispered of children fainting in school, of mothers trading jewelry for a single loaf on the black market. Yet in Nebraska, the Germans saw a different reality. At harvest time, grain poured into silos until they overflowed. Trucks arrived too late to carry it all, and piles of golden corn lay exposed under the open sky. The guards laughed and said it didn't matter, there was more than enough. Some of the prisoners were sent to dairy farms, where they watched in stunned silence as fresh milk was poured into roadside ditches. Prices had collapsed because production exceeded demand. Farmers explained, almost apologetically, that they had to dump thousands of gallons to stabilize the market. To German eyes, it was madness. In their homeland, children drank watery skim, sometimes none at all, while here milk flowed into the soil as waste. The mathematics were merciless. In 1944, America produced more than 127 million tons of grain, 4 times Germany's output, and slaughtered 24 million head of cattle. German herds had shrunk so badly that meat rations had fallen to barely 200 grams per week for civilians. The Reich fought to keep its people from starvation. The United States fought to keep food prices from collapsing under the weight of abundance. The prisoners murmured bitterly among themselves. "They drowned in surplus, while our children starve," one said. Another clenched his fists and swore that if Berlin ever learned the truth, the war would end tomorrow. But they knew it would not. Hitler and Goebbels would dismiss these sights as fabrications, as tricks of American propaganda. Yet the men could not deny what they saw with their own eyes: orchards heavy with fruit, fields thick with cattle, warehouses stacked with canned goods destined for Allied armies across the oceans. One recalled that in his village at home, his mother had stood in line for hours to buy a handful of turnips. Here, turnips rotted in the fields because no one bothered to harvest them. The guards, again, did not brag. They simply shrugged at the waste. To them, it was normal. One farmer's wife explained that the government paid subsidies to destroy crops because there was simply too much. The words echoed in the prisoners' ears like a verdict. Germany's war economy was collapsing from scarcity. America's greatest problem was overproduction. They had believed the war would be decided by tanks and aircraft, by steel and blood. Now they realized it was decided in these fields long before the battles were fought. That night, lying in their bunks, the prisoners spoke quietly. Some cursed fate, others cursed their leaders. A few simply fell silent, staring into the dark as if they could see the mountains of wasted food still glowing in memory. One wrote in his hidden diary, "This is our true defeat, not Stalingrad, not Africa. Here, in Nebraska, I have seen more bread wasted in a week than our entire village eats in a year. We are not fighting an enemy of men, but of numbers, of abundance, of a machine that feeds itself and never stops." The next morning the prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven to the edge of the fields. The guards handed them tools, not rifles, and pointed them toward rows of corn and wheat waiting to be gathered. At first the Germans worked stiffly, some with resentment, others with curiosity. But as the hours passed, they began to notice the rhythm of American farming. Combines roared in the distance, threshing and cutting at a pace that made their manual labor seem symbolic rather than necessary. They pulled ears of corn, bundled stalks, and stacked bales, but the machines outpaced them effortlessly. It was as if their work was for show, a gesture to occupy men who otherwise would have been idle. When the midday whistle blew, the guards called them back to a shaded grove near a farmhouse. There, waiting on long wooden tables, were lunches packed in brown paper sacks. Each prisoner received one, and when they opened them, silence fell. Inside was food they had not seen in years. Thick sandwiches layered with beef and cheese. Apples so fresh the skin gleamed. Cartons of milk still cold, even small slices of pie. One man held up his sandwich in disbelief, weighing it in his hand, heavier than the entire ration he had received in a week on the Eastern Front. Another prisoner bit into the apple and felt tears sting his eyes. He remembered his wife writing from Cologne that their children had not tasted fruit in months. Here, in captivity, he ate like a king compared to his family back home. The guards sat nearby, eating identical meals. There was no distinction between captor and captive in terms of quality. Everyone had enough, more than enough. One prisoner whispered that this was America's true weapon: sandwiches and tractors, milk and pies. Another muttered that if their comrades at the front could see this, they would lay down their arms tomorrow. The work resumed in the afternoon, but the mood had shifted. Instead of resentment, the Germans moved in silence, each man lost in thought. Some tried to calculate how many sandwiches like these could be made from the mountains of grain they had seen. Others thought of the meat piled high in American barns, the milk tanks brimming to the edge. The realization spread quietly. They were not merely defeated soldiers. They were witnesses to a civilization of abundance so vast that their own Reich, with all its boasts and propaganda, seemed like a medieval kingdom in comparison. As the sun dipped low, the prisoners were marched back to camp. In their pockets they carried the apple cores, the crusts of pie, scraps they could not bear to throw away. One man carefully wrapped the remains of his sandwich in paper, determined to keep it until the next day as a reminder that such a meal had once passed through his hands. Lying in the barracks that night, the smell of diesel from the tractors still lingering on the air, they whispered to one another about the day. Some tried to laugh, others cursed, but none could deny the truth. They had eaten better as prisoners of war in America than as free men serving the Reich. The illusions that Nazi propaganda had hammered into them for years began to crumble completely when they saw who truly powered America's fields and factories. On one farm, a group of prisoners was sent to assist with repairs, expecting to meet grizzled men with decades of experience. Instead, they found women in overalls, their hair tied back, confidently operating welding torches and guiding tractors across the rows. The Germans stood dumbfounded. In the Reich, women had been told their duty was Kinder, Kirche children, kitchen, church. Here in America, women were not just present, but indispensable, commanding machines larger than trucks, maintaining engines with precision, feeding a nation at war without hesitation. On another day, they were marched past a cotton field worked not by slaves, as Nazi caricature suggested, but by African-American farmers, using motorized pickers and tractors. The guards introduced them casually as neighbors, co-owners of the land. One young black mechanic greeted the Germans in accented English while repairing a combine, his hands moving confidently through gears and belts. The prisoners whispered in disbelief. Back home, they had been told that such people were inferior, incapable of advanced work. Yet here was a man keeping $1 million machine running while German factories struggled to keep trucks on the road. The numbers tore at their minds. 6 million American women had entered the workforce during the war, many in agriculture and heavy industry. African-American workers filled shipyards, steel mills, and aircraft plants, producing tanks, planes, and guns by the tens of thousands. In Germany, the regime had refused to mobilize women fully until it was too late, clinging to ideological purity even as shortages strangled production. Hitler had insisted that the German woman must remain in her place, while Roosevelt's America trained entire armies of women riveters, welders, and farmers. The prisoners began to argue among themselves in hushed voices. Some still clung to Hitler's vision, insisting that America's reliance on women and minorities proved its weakness, but the evidence was relentless. The tractors moved, the harvest filled the silos, the factories delivered bombers at rates Germany could not match. One prisoner muttered that the Reich had lost the war the moment it decided half its population was unfit for real labor. Another said nothing, only stared as a young woman guided a tractor through the fields with the calm authority of a general. At night in the barracks, the conversations turned darker. Men who had once boasted of Aryan superiority now admitted their doubts. If these people, whom we were told were weak, can build machines like this and feed millions, one whispered, then everything we believed was a lie. Another prisoner, an officer educated in economics, confessed quietly that the Reich's defeat was not only on the battlefield, but in the factory, the farm, the schoolhouse where American women and minorities had been trained to replace men at the front. The guards, still indifferent, handed out rations without comment. But to the Germans, every sandwich, every tractor, every confident gesture of a woman worker was a nail driven into the coffin of Nazi ideology. What had once been unshakable faith in the Reich's destiny was dissolving into a quiet, painful recognition. The world they had been promised never existed, and the war they were fighting was already lost. Not because of tanks or planes, but because America had unlocked the strength of all its people. The breaking point came slowly, not with a single revelation, but with the weight of numbers pressing down day after day until resistance was useless. In the evenings, the guards sometimes left newspapers lying about, and those who could read English pieced together fragments of truth. American wheat harvests measured not in tons but in billions of bushels. Cornfields so vast they could supply grain not only to every American family, but also to Britain, Russia, and still send convoys to Africa. The prisoners compared these figures with what they remembered from home. Ration cards that allowed 200 grams of meat a week, ersatz bread filled with sawdust, children lining up for watery soup in bombed-out schools. The contrast was unbearable. One captain, a veteran of the Eastern Front, tried to calculate aloud. A single Nebraska farm of 2,000 acres with its machines and silos could outproduce his entire Bavarian district, which had fed hundreds of families. America had over 6 million such farms. It was like facing not one enemy, but an empire of fields stretching from coast to coast, each one an arsenal of bread and meat. The mathematics of war no longer worked in Germany's favor. The Reich could conscript millions of men, but it could not conjure food from empty soil. America's children, women, and farmers had already won. The prisoners remembered Hitler's promises that the East would feed Germany, that the Ukraine would be the Reich's breadbasket. Yet they had seen the East turn into a wasteland of burned villages and starving peasants. Even with conquest, Germany's grain harvest never matched America's peacetime surplus. Now, with American tractors multiplying yields and American railroads carrying food across thousands of miles in days, the equation was settled beyond debate. Some prisoners muttered bitter curses, others fell silent, but none could deny the truth. What burned deepest was not only the abundance, but the effortlessness. A boy of 16 driving a machine worth more than an officer's salary, harvesting in one afternoon what a German family could not achieve in a week. A woman working at a factory riveting bombers that rolled off the line every hour. A black mechanic repairing equipment whose output equaled the labor of villages. Everything the Nazis had called weakness had become strength. Everything they had despised had become victory. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold across the Nebraska fields, a prisoner whispered to his comrade, "If their farmers can feed armies, and their factories can build bombers faster than we can believe, then our war is already finished. We were defeated before we set foot on the battlefield. The words hung heavy in the air, and no one argued. They all knew. The guards herded them back to camp, but it no longer mattered. Each prisoner carried in his mind the vision of endless fields, silos rising like fortresses, machines rumbling with power, and tables heavy with food. They had been soldiers of a regime that promised 1,000 years of empire, yet in the soil of Nebraska, they had seen the truth. The 1,000-year Reich would not last a decade. Against the abundance of America, no ideology, no army, no propaganda could stand. At last, the story reached its inevitable conclusion, not on a battlefield in Europe, but in the quiet of a Nebraska night. The prisoners lay in their bunks, the day's images burned into their minds, the roar of tractors, the glint of silos heavy with grain, the taste of sandwiches that seemed more luxurious than anything they had eaten in years. They had been soldiers of the Reich, sworn to fight for victory, yet here in captivity they had witnessed a kind of power their leaders had never understood. It was not the power of tanks or artillery alone. It was the power of abundance. America's victory had been planted in the soil long before the first shot was fired. It lived in the endless rows of wheat, in the machines that turned labor into multiplication, in the hands of women and men, of every background, who joined the work without hesitation. While Germany starved and rationed, America overflowed. While German children grew thin, American farmers worried about the price of corn collapsing from surplus. For the prisoners, this realization was more devastating than any defeat in Tunisia or Stalingrad. They had believed that courage, discipline, and ideology could win wars. Now they saw that wars were won by railroads that never stopped, by factories that built bombers faster than belief, by farms that fed allies across oceans. A boy of 16 with a tractor in Nebraska was more powerful than a regiment of German infantry. That truth broke their pride more than chains ever could. Years later, some of these men would write memoirs, confessing that the moment they lost faith in victory was not under Allied bombs, but under the American sun, watching a harvest roll in with mechanical precision. They admitted that the Reich had died not in Berlin in 1945, but in the fields of America, where surplus itself was a weapon. And so the message endures: America did not win the war only with guns and bombs. It won because its industry could build without end, because its democracy harnessed every citizen, because its abundance crushed the dreams of empire before they could be realized. For the prisoners who saw it, the lesson was unforgettable. Against a nation that could waste more food than Germany could grow, no ideology, no army, no propaganda could stand. They had been defeated by mathematics, by harvests, by machines, by freedom. The Reich's 1,000-year vision ended in less than 12, shattered by the quiet strength of farms and factories across the sea.